This video is about the transatlantic slave trade, and it offers an in-depth look at the countries that received the most African slaves. The transatlantic slave trade was one of the most devastating and dehumanizing periods in human history. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands and transported across the Atlantic Ocean to work as slaves in the Americas. This massive and brutal system of forced labor formed the backbone of the economies in the New World, creating lasting social, cultural, and economic impacts that can still be felt today. In this video, we will delve into the countries that received the largest numbers of enslaved Africans, offering a comprehensive look at the scale and legacy of this tragic period. Number 1, Brazil. The Portuguese colony of Brazil was the largest importer of African slaves during the transatlantic slave trade, receiving around 4 to 5 million enslaved Africans, which constituted about 40% of the total number. The first African slaves arrived in Brazil in the early 16th century, and the slave trade continued until it was officially abolished in 1888. The enslaved Africans in Brazil were primarily used in the production of sugar, coffee, and gold. The harsh conditions and brutal treatment led to a high mortality rate among the enslaved population. Many slaves resisted their captors through revolts, the formation of maroon communities, and the preservation of their cultural traditions. The legacy of the African slave trade in Brazil is evident in the country's diverse population, which includes a large Afro-Brazilian community. Elements of African culture, such as religion, music, and cuisine, have also left a lasting impact on Brazilian society. Number 2, British Caribbean colonies. The British Caribbean colonies, including Jamaica, Barbados, and the Leeward Islands, were another significant destination for enslaved Africans, receiving an estimated 2.5 million people. The British established their first Caribbean colony in Barbados in 1627, and the demand for labor in the sugar plantations quickly led to an increase in the importation of slaves. Life for enslaved Africans in the British Caribbean was characterized by harsh working conditions, brutal punishments, and a high mortality rate. Many slaves sought to escape their bondage by forming maroon communities or participating in revolts, such as the Jamaican Maroon Wars and the Haitian Revolution. The influence of the African slave trade can still be seen in the Caribbean today, with many people of African descent living in the region. African cultural traditions have also left a lasting impact on the Caribbean, particularly in the areas of music, dance, and cuisine. Number 3, the Spanish Americas. The Spanish colonies in the Americas, which included present-day Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, and the Caribbean, imported approximately 1.5 million African slaves. The Spanish had established the first colony in the Americas in the late 15th century, and the demand for labor in their mines and plantations led to the importation of enslaved Africans. Enslaved Africans in the Spanish Americas worked in a variety of roles, including mining, agriculture, and domestic service. They often faced harsh working conditions, and many attempted to escape or resist their enslavement through revolts and the formation of maroon communities. The legacy of the African slave trade in the Spanish Americas can still be seen today in the region's diverse population and rich cultural heritage, which includes elements of African music, dance, and religion. Number 4, the French Caribbean colonies. The French Caribbean colonies, including Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, Guadeloupe, and Martinique, received around 1.2 million African slaves during the transatlantic slave trade. The French began establishing colonies in the Caribbean in the 17th century with a focus on the production of sugar, coffee, and indigo. The labor-intensive nature of these industries led to a high demand for enslaved Africans. Life for slaves in the French Caribbean was brutal, with long hours, harsh working conditions, and severe punishments. Many slaves attempted to resist their enslavement through revolts, such as the Haitian Revolution, which ultimately led to the establishment of the first independent Black republic, Haiti, in 1804. The influence of the African slave trade in the French Caribbean can still be seen today in the region's demographics and cultural heritage. Elements of African culture have been woven into the fabric of Caribbean societies, particularly in the areas of music, dance, and religion. Number 5, the United States. The British North American colonies, which later became the United States, imported approximately 400,000 African slaves, primarily to the southern colonies. These colonies relied heavily on the labor of enslaved Africans to produce crops such as tobacco, rice, and cotton. The treatment of slaves in the United States varied by region, but it was generally characterized by brutality, forced labor, and the dehumanization of enslaved individuals. Many slaves sought to resist their bondage through escapes, revolts, and the formation of maroon communities. The legacy of the African slave trade in the United States is still felt today, particularly in the country's racial and social dynamics. The African American community has made significant contributions to American culture, particularly in the areas of music, literature, and civil rights activism. In conclusion, the transatlantic slave trade was a tragic and inhumane period in human history that forcibly uprooted millions of Africans from their homelands and brought them to the Americas as slaves. Brazil, the British Caribbean colonies, the Spanish Americas, the French Caribbean colonies, and the United States were the primary destinations for enslaved Africans who were forced to endure unimaginable suffering and hardship. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade is still felt today as the descendants of these enslaved Africans continue to grapple with the lasting effects of this dark chapter in history. However, the resilience and strength of the African diaspora have led to the development of rich cultural traditions and contributions to the countries where their ancestors were once enslaved. By understanding and acknowledging the history and impact of the transatlantic slave trade, we can work towards healing the wounds of the past and building a more just and equitable future. Thank you.